Hello, everyone. My name is Neil Tutlam, originally from South Sudan. I came to the United States as a refugee many, many years ago. And today I'm really, really delighted to speak to you about doing research. A little bit of background about myself. As I mentioned earlier on, I grew up in Ethiopia. So I started school in Ethiopia, then went to high school in Kenya. And when I came to the United States, I decided to go to college to pursue a bachelor's degree in biology at Tennessee State University. Then I decided that was not enough, so I went to graduate school and obtained a Master of Public Health degree in epidemiology from St. Louis University, and then worked for a little bit in clinical research, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and then went back to school to pursue my PhD in public health studies with concentration in epidemiology. And then this year, I was fortunate enough to do a postdoc training in the LEAD Global Training Program, and had terrific mentors. One of whom you may know, or you may know both of them, Dr. Teresa Betancourt and Dr. Fred Samala, a gentleman from Uganda. I currently work at St. Louis County Department of Public Health, where I manage the chronic disease epidemiology program. Well, that's my job before COVID anyway. We don't do a lot of COVID, chronic diseases at the moment because of our response to COVID. But that's my regular job. So I manage the chronic disease epi program. I also manage a minority youth violence prevention grant that was funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, and I took a couple of classes at the university. So I'm an epidemiologist. I happened to be in London one time a couple of years ago. So I went to the John Snow pub in London. That's the picture you see there. So, as I mentioned, after graduate school, I went on to work at the Washington University School of Medicine. I've been very fortunate to work with very productive group of people. So I first started as a research assistant in infectious diseases. Doing basically one of my first projects working on was doing automated surveillance on certain bloodstream infections. As you can see there, I have given you a sample of some of the publications from the project that I've been engaged in. And then I worked as a research coordinator in the Department of Neurology, the multiple sclerosis section, where part of my responsibilities was everything from scanning brains of people with multiple sclerosis, optic nerves of people with multiple sclerosis, using some really cutting edge work technology that we were able to looking at movement of water molecules. We call that diffusion tensor imaging. And I did everything from scanning those and processing those images and getting those numbers out of those, so that we can analyze the data to be able to predict, who would likely recover, who, what their prognosis would be, and things like that. Then I did some work also as a data analyst in the Department of OBGYN. Basically, I would, help the researchers, how to ask their questions, how to analyze their data, how to collect their data, and things like that. Really exciting work as well, and I've been fortunate to work with very great group of people throughout my early research career, and you can see there are some of the publications that we were been able to publish from this work I show you here. So for obvious reasons, the focus of my researcher and really my passion is on the study of the impact of war trauma on different populations. As you already know, war has some really negative impacts on populations, particularly the mental health of populations. But various studies have found that the most common trauma-related psychiatric disorders, mental disorders, include anxiety, depression, and PTSD, and we have varying levels of disease burden, depending on what instruments was used to measure them, different settings, and things like that. We can talk about that if you have the time, but suffice to know that these are the most common trauma-related disorders, and there are these different varying levels by settings. So, like I just mentioned, I'm originally from South Sudan. My research focus right now is on South Sudan, and just want to speak with you in terms of the context. Some of you, you may be already aware, South Sudan is a country that, South Sudan, or the old Sudan, is a country that has been at war essentially for the last, almost 70 years. As you can see, the first war started in August of 1955 and ended in 1972. That was called the First Sudanese Civil War. That was between the North and South Sudan. And even though that war ended in 1972, there are historians that suggest really never that war never really ended, because some rebel groups did not join the peace. People like my father opted to stay away from that peace and stayed out, and there were some small rebel groups that would attack government positions and all that. So really there wasn't peace across the country in 1970 after the signing of the Addis Ababa Agreement in 1972. And then the second round of war broke out in 1983. This was led obviously by Dr. John Garang Dimabur, when SPLM, SPLA decided to wage a rebellion against the government. So this war started in 1983 all the way up to 2005, when the comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government and the South Sudanese. So this was called the North-South conflict. Had a lot of economic issues attached to it, religious issues, race and things like that. As if that wasn't enough, though, between 1991 and 2002, even though the Southerners were fighting against the North, the Southerners also fought amongst themselves. And so these internecine conflicts where very closely related communities were fighting against each other, so and really committing serious atrocities. And all told, by the end of all these conflicts, we lost about 2.5 million people, about 4 million people displaced. And just for context, South Sudan right now, the estimates are that the population of South Sudan is about 11 million people. So South Sudan gained its independence from the old Sudan in 2011, and right 2 years after the independence, the leaders decided that we needed another round of war, and South Sudan descended into chaos that really continues up to this day. Unfortunately, that conflict took on some tribal lines, and if I was in Juba, South Sudan, I would in all likelihood have been targeted just because of my tribal background by the government. So I keep telling people that really the last 3 or 4 generations of South Sudanese have known nothing but war. So for my study, looking at the impact of war trauma of South Sudanese mothers on their children. So this is a conceptual framework that I use for my study. So this comes from the idea that trauma can be transmitted from one generation to the other. So mothers who have experienced war trauma themselves, and this can be manifested as anxiety, depression, PTSD, as we already looked at, and then this somehow can get passed on to their children, and children can express this can be manifested as aggressive behavior, antisocial behavior, anxiety, depression, and PTSD. I also wanted to be able to look at what the risk factors are for people who have been exposed to trauma, what then leads them to either develop these trauma-associated disorders, or what are these protective factors? Why don't people who have experienced trauma show these symptoms? Similarly with the children, wanted to be able to also determine that. And I'll just show you some data from my research. This is for South Sudanese children, and these are children, mind you, children who are born in the United States themselves, are not exposed to any war trauma. As you can see, the aggressive behavior, about 12% of at least of the sample that I studied, 8% anxiety and social behavior, about 7% depression, 11% PTSD. And if you compare this to the general United States population of kids similar age, these are kids between the age of 5 and 17, you can see there that is these rates are much higher compared to the general US population. And this is a paper we published from looking at specifically the mothers, and as you can see there, about 26% of these women that I studied, had PTSD. 29% had depression. About 40% of them had anxiety disorder, and there are a number of risk factors as to why, or why they develop these disorders and not. And so why do I do this research? I think is a question that I get asked. Obviously, as I already mentioned, I'm a child of the war, born during the war, just before the 83 conflict erupted, and so I have known war essentially all of my life. And the first direct contact I came into with to war conflict was when the town we were living in was attacked in way back when 1984. So basically I was just 6 years old at the time, and we had to run, flee for our lives with people being shot and all that. We spent a number of days in the bush, and so that I still remember that very vividly, even though I was so young at the time. And then we came to the refugee camp in Ethiopia. Thankfully, we didn't have to live in the refugee camps. Part of my family comes from Ethiopia, and then my dad, being who he was at that time, we were fortunate enough not to live in the refugee camps, but we lived in a small town called Gambela in southwest Ethiopia. I went to school there, so I really didn't have to experience a lot of the things that people experience in the refugee camp. So in that sense, I was very fortunate. But when the Ethiopian government that was supporting the South Sudanese at that time was toppled from power, the government of Mengistu Haile Mariam, we all got chased out of Ethiopia. We had to flee back into South Sudan, even though the war was still raging at that time. We had to walk on foot all the way back to South Sudan. Took us, I think, more than a month walking back to our old home area. During the war, lost so many relatives, very close relatives, uncles, cousins, who were fighting in the front lines, and then other relatives. Obviously, war doesn't only kill people as a direct through direct combat, but people die from diseases, famine, and all that. And these were fairly common. When we went back to South Sudan in 1991, 1992, this was during the famine. There was no food. So people literally had to walk from place to place for days on end, just to be able to find food. And then eventually, I lost my own father in a plane crash during the war. It was one of those military planes. My father was one of the freedom fighters at that time. And so for years, I've had to deal with my own PTSD, and I talk about that openly with people. And so I give them some sort of background to show them where I come from and why I am engaged in this research. So in a way, I do this research to understand what I went through myself, my family, and then the other thing that also bothers me is that this idea of the intergenerational transmission of trauma. The next generation of kids are being affected by this conflict, and particularly here, South Sudanese who live in the United States, the kids are having all these emotional problems, as I showed you in the data that I just showed you. Kids aren't going to school, kids are getting into trouble with the law and all that. So as a researcher, I wanted to be able to understand what is going on in the community, so that I can help address some of these problems. And so that's why I'm really fortunate to have the mentors that I have that are helping me sort of ask and answer some of these questions, and how we can help the community in general. So what I would say is, when you do research, when you have a passion for it, you have sort of a purpose for it, that is purpose that is bigger than yourself, I think it becomes even a lot more rewarding. I can do this, without even, worrying about what else is out there. And this really drives me and to be able to be successful in this work. And, have Thank you very much for listening. I provided my contact here. Please feel free to correspond. I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have going forward. Have a great time.